I'm sure are familiar with the Lindbergh story. That's the most famous story ever written. And millions of words written about Lindbergh. This presentation is not about Lindbergh. This presentation today covers a couple of questions. First question, why was the Spirit of St. Louis built in San Diego in the first place? And we'll get to that as we go through the presentation. Second part of the presentation will be a high-level review of Donald Hall's report on the preparation and construction of the Spirit of St. Louis here in San Diego. And my approach to this material is not to use my words. All the words you will see of our Spirit right out there. And which is an important piece of this talk this morning. On the screen right now is a picture of my son doing his homework in Hawaii back in 1972, and myself being an ex-naval aviator, he was enraptured with aviation stuff. And I built a lot of model airplanes for him, hung them up on the ceiling and whatnot. And he wanted a model airplane of the Spirit of St. Louis, and I couldn't find one. So I said, well, next best thing, I'll just paint a picture on your wall. And so that's what you see there. He's doing his homework. He was a better student than I was, by far. So that's why the picture is there. And I'm going to hit the right button. Here we are. This is the title of Donald Hall's report to the Committee for Aeronautics in Washington, D.C. He wrote this report just a few weeks after the flight. And the reason that he wrote the report was really to dispel misinformation that was already starting to find its way around the world about the Spirit of St. Louis, what it was, how it was, what its performance was, what its origins were, all of that. So he wrote this report primarily to set the record straight on the design of the airplane and its construction. Color coding. Now, oh, here we go. All right. There's a prologue, which has nothing to do with the Spirit of St. Louis, but it has a lot to do with why a Spirit of St. Louis came about. In April 1913, the London newspaper, the Daily Mail, offered a £10,000 prize for the first aviator to cross the Atlantic Ocean, east to west, west to east, within 72 continuous hours. The war started. That went on hold. At the conclusion of World War I, he reissued that prize. And crossing the North Atlantic is a huge challenge. South Atlantic, not so much so. But the North Atlantic, with its weather, temperatures, storms, breadth, distance, for the technology, aviation technology at the time, that was a big challenge. No one had been able to do it by 1918. And it was just waiting there. And it was a tempting effort for most of the larger aviation companies at the time, and for a few adventurers who wished to cash in on the prize, for one thing. Well, the Navy had a military interest in being able to fly across the Atlantic Ocean, and they decided to put together a project to fly across the Atlantic Ocean. And they had nothing to do with the daily mails contest or any of that. It was just the timing was coincidental. But in May of 1919, a crew of United States Navy and Coast Guard aviators flew the MC-4, which you see right here, Curtiss float plane, actually a seaplane, from Newfoundland to the Azores, Portugal, Plymouth, England, and along the way they got a little help. U.S. Navy posted ships a little over 50 miles apart all the way across the Atlantic Ocean. And the three Curtiss flying boats that started the trip, they all made it as far as the Azores. Two of them went down on the way. One of them, let me get my pointer out here, point it out. Number 3, which is the one furthest back that you see right there. This is the third, this is Curtiss number 3. Curtiss number 3 went down all the way to the Azores. And number 3 taxied from this position all the way down to Delgado. Number 4 continued on to England. Well, that was a tremendous undertaking, very costly, obviously. Not something any civilian agency could possibly even contemplate doing. And it was a very important technological undertaking. However, about 2 weeks later, a much more important crossing of the Atlantic occurred. And that was Alcock and Brown. Now they were responding to a prize, and the British government allowed them to do so. But of course they were sponsored by the British military. They flew a Vickers Vimy bomber from St. John's, Newfoundland. Of course they had to ship it over to Newfoundland. And they flew west to east, which is the prevailing wind across the Atlantic Ocean. And this is a remarkable flight. I have flown thousands and thousands of miles across the ocean, the Pacific Ocean, not the Atlantic. And what these gentlemen did with this airplane is just astounding. Almost 2,000 miles over water, a twin-engine airplane of 1919 vintage and technology, modified bomber, not the most streamlined airplane that was ever put to the air. Anyway, they made it. And while the military was interested in all of that, commercial aviation was really starting to gin up about 1919, the end of World War I. And several aviation companies started looking at the Atlantic as an opportunity to commercialize, obviously. And that impetus created a number of aviation companies that started developing long-range aircraft. I'm going to get this straight. Okay, so while that was going on with fixed-wing aircraft, the dirigible industry was also progressing. And about a week or so after Alcock's trip, here comes the R-34, also making a west to east run. And they shipped it over to the US, and then they flew it back to, they flew it to the United States, crossing the Atlantic in July of 1919. It was not a civilian flight, it was a military flight, it didn't have passengers. But it proved the point, and from then on, dirigible started to be one of the primary vehicles for crossing the Atlantic. Carried a lot of people. Also, at the end of the First World War, there was a lot of surplus aviation inventory of it. And the United States government started selling it off. And one of the things they sold off were Jenny trainers. And they became very, very popular. There were a lot of pilots right away that were out of a job at the end of World War I. But they knew how to fly. And they could buy a Jenny for about $500 and in the crate, get it assembled, and start giving rides, participating in air shows, flying people on charter flights from one point to another. So it became a business. Barnstorming became a business. Barnstorming troops were all across the United States. Claude Ryan was one, Lindbergh was one. That's what they were doing, honing their skills as aviators. And then the Airmail Service opted for an aviation component. So they started letting contracts for air carrying of the mail. And the Jenny was used a lot for that purpose. The Jenny, you all know, was very popular. It was not it wasn't easy to fly. Didn't have nice flight characteristics, didn't have nice flight harmonics, but it was cheap and it was available. A competitor to the Jenny was the Standard, the Lincoln Standard J1. Looks like a Jenny, it's not a Jenny. They share a common design mentor, an Englishman, de Havilland, created a trainer that both Curtiss and Standard basically copied and made their own modification. But the Lincoln Standard was delivered to the Army Air Corps with a 4-cylinder Paul Scott engine. It was underpowered from the get-go. Nobody liked it. They thought it was unsafe. The Army Air Corps did not uncrate the remaining, after their testing of the aircraft. They didn't upgrade the ones that they had bought. The war was over, and so thousands of standard Lincoln J1s were sitting in crates in warehouses all over the southern United States. And they put those on the market. And some really enterprising ex-aviators started modifying them, because also, at the same time, thousands of Hispano Suiza of V8 150 horsepower engines became available. And if you put a 150 horsepower V8 in a J1 standard, it transformed the airplane. It became the best aerobatic airplane on the circuit. Everybody wanted it. Lindbergh got one. So it was the go-to airplane. And why is that important? It's important because the airplane was the first home-built passenger-carrying aircraft that Ryan Airlines built. They modified a standard to be the first home-built, four-place passenger-carrying aircraft. It was very important for me. Claude Ryan comes on the scene at the same time here, coincident with the end of the war, the availability of Jennies and standards, and he started a flying service in San Diego following his Air Corps career. That's where he learned to fly. A lot of those pilots out there. And so this flying service was charter flights, sightseeing around the bay, air shows on the weekends, that sort of thing. And shortly, within 2 years after he started that business, B.F. Mahoney moves to San Diego, Benjamin Franklin Mahoney. And Mahoney was infatuated with aviation, as many, many people were. And he had the money to indulge his interest. And so he went to the Ryan Flying School, and Ryan taught him to fly. And he hung around, and he flew, and he got himself he bought his own airplane, which was a Scout. And he parked it at the airfield and flew it whenever wanted to go flying. He struck up a friendship with Ryan, and not long after they became good friends, Mahoney, being a businessman, thought there was more money to be made flying passengers on a regular schedule between San Diego and Los Angeles than there was in charter flights and sightseeing tours and air shows. And he convinced Ryan of that, and they formed a little partnership where Mahoney would fund the operation and Ryan would provide the equipment and facilities, and they started the Los Angeles San Diego Airline, March the 1st, 1925. Donald Albert Hall, born in 1898. They're all about the same age. These guys are all in their mid-20s. Graduated from Pratt Institute. Worked for Douglas. He also went to the Army Air Corps to learn to fly along with Lindbergh and Ryan. But he didn't graduate in his class. But he did get to fly, and he understood the principles of flying and what the problems were with it from a pilot's perspective. And he came down to San Diego, worked for Douglas. While he was at Douglas, he found out about Ryan Airlines. They needed an engineer. came down to San Diego and they hired him, 31 January 1927, as chief engineer. Ryan Airlines. April 19, 1925, Mahoney bought an undivided half interest in Ryan's operations. Aircraft manufacturing, Ryan Flying Company, charter and sightseeing business, Ryan School of Aviation flight training in Los Angeles, San Diego Airlines. And those of you who have a business background or have dealt in purchases of real property and assets and those sorts of things will know that an undivided half interest is a very, very significant clause in your contract. What it means is each partner owns an undivided interest in every piece of the company, everything, all the assets, all the inventory, all the business, all the intellectual property. Undivided means you can't separate it. You can't say, well, I'll sell this piece and you keep that piece. It doesn't work that way. You sell it all with the other partner's acquiescence, or you don't sell it at all. So that undivided interest comes into play. There's the paper. Of course, it was drawn up later by a lawyer and put all the right terms in there and all that sort of thing, but this is how they started their business, with a note, handwritten note by Claude, selling his undivided half interest of the business to Mahoney. And that's Ryan Airlines. 3 airplanes. They bought 2 standards, modified them to 4-passenger aircraft. So there were 4 passengers and a pilot. They were enclosed. Holly Bolus did all of the design and manufacturing work to convert the airplanes from 2-seater trainers to 4-passenger carrying airliners. Donald Douglas built the airplane you see in the center there. It's a Douglas Cloudster. Donald Douglas, that was his first design as an independent designer. And it was designed as a competition aircraft to do endurance flights. And the only one built. And it started out on its journey to break the record, got over El Paso, and the engine gave him problems, and they had to land in El Paso, and so he was out of the running, and he sold the airplane at the airport on the ground to a fellow who wanted to convert it into an airliner. And that happened, and he didn't do well in his business, and he sold it to Claude Ryan. Holly Bolus got a hold of it. The first owner had basically used the airplane by just widening the front cockpit and carrying a couple of passengers, but it didn't work out financially, so he sold it to Ryan. Holly Bolus made it a 10-passenger airliner. Extensive modification. This is the standard we just talked about. You can see the configuration there. The passengers were sitting in the area that was originally occupied by the front cockpit. And then Holly Bolus widened that area, lengthened it a little bit, couldn't get it too far forward because the engine firewall got in the way, and kept the pilot's position in the same position it was in the original standard. But it became a 4-passenger aircraft. And they made some accommodations for passengers. They ran the exhaust pipe, you can see, down out of the way to kind of carry the exhaust back behind the passengers and wouldn't overwhelm them in their passenger compartment. But it was a very good airplane, actually. You can see the difference between it and the standard original configuration. And so Holly Bolus made all of these changes. He designed it. He was a very successful glider, competitor, and designer and builder. So he had a foundational aviation engineering background. So while he wasn't a certified engineer, he was certainly an outstanding lay engineer. And so there's the loading ramp for a cloud step. It's really a ladder with some handrails on it. I wouldn't be enthusiastic about taking my wife up in an airplane like that on a long journey from San Diego to LA, but people did. And it was the middle of a big, big problem in the United States with alcohol. So prohibition was kind of at its peak. And the airline business had little ups and downs. You didn't have a good passenger load this week or next week, or maybe you didn't have anything scheduled. Well, the guys down south needed to move their beer. And so they hired Ryan Airlines to haul it for them from time to time. And that's what you see going on here. That's their terminal down south. About this time, since they were in the airline business, and they had gained considerable experience in aircraft manufacturing when they modified the standards and the cloud step. And so the two of them turned to Holly Bolus. Bolus said, yeah, we could build aircraft if you wanted to do that, but you got to find a stress engineer and a design engineer to come up with the project. Yeah, I can manage the manufacturing, but I can't do the stress analysis on a engine-powered aircraft. Well, there was an engineer in Los Angeles, William Waterhouse, and he was working at Douglas also, and he had a reputation as an excellent designer. And he went out on his own, started a design company, teamed up with a gentleman named Lloyd Royer, and they formed the Waterhouse Royer Aircraft Manufacturing Company. But they could never gin up enough finances to actually manufacture it. But they had plans, and they had an idea. Ryan Airlines knew of this company, of course, because they're flying in and out of the same airport where they were located. And Ryan goes up and cuts a deal with Waterhouse to buy a set of plans, which were plans for the cruise air, they called it. And so we started building the airplane here. And when they got down to the tail, they didn't have drawings for the empennage. And they waited, and they waited, and they waited, and they waited for a long time, and the plans didn't materialize. And Ryan went up, talked to Waterhouse. There's no record of what the conversation was. The upshot was they broke up their relationship and went their own way. Claude came back empty-handed, no plans. Holly Bola says, well, since there's not a lot of stress work to be done at the empennage end, and all the fuselage comes together, and it's a robust system, I think I could do the tape. And so he did. And so we came up with the M1 mail plane. It was very successful. I say very successful. They built about 30 airframes during its life, but those were sold primarily to airmail contract flyers up and down the coast. Pacific Air Transport was one. And airmail pilots, and they were flying from city to city, and they were seeing each other and bumping into each other and talking to each other, of course, and then they're passing down the line information. And Lindbergh heard about this airplane. So it was kind of tucked away in the back of his mind when he started his efforts to find one. We'll come back to that in just a second. This is the M2, Ryan M2. The M2 was a variation on the M1. The M1 had some deficiencies, and it was somewhat heavy, and its performance was marginal. Not marginal. It was not as efficient as you might want for its purpose. So Ryan Airlines brings an engineer down from Douglas, Jack Northrop, young engineer, came down, and Douglas agreed to let him come down and work weekends at Ryan to help them with modifying the M1 to strengthen it and improve its performance. And they did that, or Northrop did that, by redesigning the wing main spar. The original main spar was a box section spar. And Northrop redesigned that to an I section spar, which is about half the material. So they saved a considerable amount of weight just by that one design change. And of course he did the stress analysis and all that stuff for it. So it all came out kosher. And at the same time, they did a little bit of design work on the fuselage with some slight changes. They added stringers down the fuselage side, which improved the aerodynamics of the airplane. And they moved a few pieces around inside the cockpit area because they also carried 2 passengers with this plane from time to time. So they made that a little bit more comfortable. And that was the M2. And so the M2, and M1 total combined production 30 plus airplanes. Here are the two compared side by side. And the only thing you'll see visually when you look at the two to distinguish them is the stringers going down the side of the M2. And that is a giveaway right there. You can't see the green spar and you can't see the changes that were made to the fuselage. They took a M2 with the idea of coming up with a fully enclosed cabin airplane. And so they modified an M2 with an enclosed cabin, as you see here. And it was a very good airplane, had good performance, comfortable. It was a starting point for them to eventually build the Brom. And so while the Brom didn't evolve directly from this airplane, this was the inspiration. So some of the basic features of the airplane were carried into the Brom. And it was used as an executive transport. They never put it into production. Late 1926, Ryan and Mahoney were having some difficulties with each other. they were struggling over how to recapitalize and refinance Ryan Airlines. Now, Ryan Airlines is the corporate structure name for all of the Ryan associated businesses. The flight school, training, aircraft manufacturing, etc., and airline, all under the umbrella of Ryan Airlines. And Claude Ryan, to kind of cut his losses, he initiated conversation with the Siemens company in Germany for the possibility of him being the U.S. distributor for Siemens air-cooled aircraft engine, the Siemens Halsby engine, 9-cylinder air-cooled radial. And shortly thereafter, in November of 1926, the partners dissolved their association. And here's the notice that went out in the paper. And the notice says that T. Claude Ryan has retired from said firm and business. And the deal was $25,000 plus a brand new M2. And so that was the sales price. And Mahoney put it up, and Claude left the company. So, just at that time, Lindbergh comes into the mix. And Lindbergh is looking, he's become enamored of participating in this Ortiz prize, $25,000 prize for the first non-stop flight from New York to Paris. And it's not stipulated, single pilot, dual pilot, crew, no crew, simply New York to Paris. And Ortega was a hotelier in New York, very successful, but really done well, and he also was infatuated with aviation, and that's why he put the prize up. Put it up originally before World War I was over, but they had to put it on hold also until the end of the war, and then he reopened that prize. A lot of folks were interested in that for two things, not just the money, but for the publicity they would get if it was their airplane that made that trip. Lindbergh was, at the time, the chief pilot at Robertson Aviation, and Robertson Aviation had a contract mailroom, and Lindbergh was the chief pilot and instructor pilot, and he flew his assigned mail routes. St. Louis, Chicago, that area. Bad weather area. And so he got a lot of inclement weather flying, night flying, instrument flying. And he was an excellent pilot. He held the record for parachute jumps, emergency parachute jumps, where he had to jump out of the airplane 4 times. That's a record, that's an accomplishment in itself to survive that, but he did at that time. In any case, he became fixed on getting into that contest. And so he started writing out a plan on how he was going to do that. He's a very focused gentleman whenever he sets his mind to achieve something. And so he laid out what he wanted. He wanted a single engine airplane for reliability, because his idea, it's not necessarily true, but his idea was that the more engines you have, the more opportunity there is for engine failure, and that'll end your flight. And there's some truth to that. But anyway, he thought that single engine, single pilot, because I don't want the complexity of argument or decision making or a compromise position having to be taken with the equipment that I'm going to fly. So it was going to be single pilot. His airplane, he was the pilot, one engine. So that's his basic parameter. And now he starts looking for an airplane that would fill that requirement, those requirements. Well, we'll skip on by here. I already talked about that. There were a number of airplanes actually available that had the capability of flying across the Atlantic Ocean. And 3 of them are shown here. The Belanca WB-2, Wright Belanca Model 2, had the same engine that Lindbergh was looking for, the Wright J5 engine. So that one was out there. And in fact, it was available because Wright had finished their evaluation. They built the airplane to test Wright engines. And at the end of that test program, the airplane was sold to the Columbia Aircraft Company, and they owned the airplane at the time. And they entered it in many contests, and it was a contest winner, and it had a very proven record. So that was Lindbergh's primary focus. He wanted that airplane, and it was for sale. And so he approached Belanca, or Columbia, and he initiated negotiations with him. They actually cut a deal. He could buy the airplane with one proviso. And Lindbergh didn't find this out until he had put the check down on Levine's desk, $15,000 check. And Levine said, the only proviso is that we get to choose the crew. And Lindbergh was dumbfounded. He said, no, that's not in the deal. It's my airplane, I'll do what I want with it. No, we choose the crew. Lindbergh picked up his check and walked out, and as he was walking out the door, Levine says, call me in the morning. Now that kind of sounds like, well, let me get together with my guys and we'll talk about it and see if we can give you what you want. And Lindbergh left. He called 8 o'clock the next morning. And Levine says, did you think it over? Lindbergh hung up the phone. He didn't even answer. And he had his tail between his legs, and he called his backers back in St. Louis and said the deal fell through. And Bixby, who headed up the financial end of the project, he said, don't worry about it. There are other planes out there. Go find what you need. And so they started talking a little bit. And he flew back to St. Louis. And he said, well, there's this outfit. Well, he approached these other companies. Travel Air, he went to Travel Air. And Travel Air wouldn't even talk to him. They had built this airplane that you see right here, but they wouldn't even talk to him. Well, the fellow that they sold this airplane to was the Phillips Petroleum Company here, and he had a lot of money, and he had a lot of influence. And they were building other Travel Aircraft 5000, they had them on the line, but this one was already built, ready to go, painted up. But they wouldn't talk to Lindbergh, one-man show it was. And he looked at Fokker, he went to Fokker, and Fokker said, yeah, we've got a single-engine airplane, monoplane, that'll do what you want to do, but we're not going to sell a single-engine airplane to fly across the Atlantic Ocean. We'll give you a 3-engine airplane for $100,000. And Lindbergh said, no, thank you. And that's when he sent a wire to San Diego. And he said to his backers, I've heard of these people. They've got a good reputation. And Bixby said, get on the train and go down there and talk to them. Backing up a little bit to the right, why it was his first choice. At the end of the day, it looks exactly like the Spirit of St. Louis. It has exactly the same specs. It has the same fuel. It has the same wingspan. It has the same gross weight. The only thing different about it is the slight profile difference in the vertical fin. It looks a little bit different. If you read the specs, they're all the same. They're within 5% of each other all the way down the line. Actually, the airplane came in behind Lindbergh after Lindbergh landed in Paris. This airplane was on his tail and flew all the way to Germany. But he wasn't first. First counts. And so, he sends this note down to San Diego. Can you construct whirlwind engine plane capable of flying nonstop between New York and Paris? Stop. If so, please state cost and delivery. Ryan Airlines didn't know about Lindbergh, and Lindbergh really didn't know anything about them, but they got together. And they built the Spirit of St. Louis. This is the frontispiece of the report that Dr. Hall sent to the Committee for Aeronautics. And it's online, you can find it, it's a PDF form you can download yourself and take a look at it. This is the title. By the way, what I've done is copied the words out of the report. So when you see the words up here, their own specifications and all of that sort of thing, it's lifted out of the report. And he states right up front why he's writing this report. In order to clarify the current impressions as to the technical preparation in conjunction with both the design and performance of the airplane Lindbergh used to fly across the Atlantic. So there was some misinformation floating around out and about. Upon his arrival at the factory, it was quickly determined that modification of the M2, which is what Lindbergh thought could be done, he's looking at it from a distance, and in fact, Mahoney and Hall are looking at it, thinking also that they could modify an M2 to do this job. But once you start doing the pencil work, get the slide rule out, start doing the stresses, and start doing the weights, it became very clear to Hall that you could not simply modify parts and pieces of the M1 or the M2 and come up with an airplane that would be safe to fly across, or that could even do the job and fly across the Atlantic. So the M2 was out. And the M2 was out. So Ryan committed to a redesign, not a redesign actually, to design a new airplane. And what he did, and I've underlined in yellow, he followed the outlines of the M2 approximately. And what that means is, here's a picture of it, and here's the slide rules and the calculations over here. That's the picture. It's going to look something like that. But I've got to do this work first before I know exactly what the final shape is going to be. And if I can use anything from the M2. So on the fuselage, this is the fuselage of the Spirit, by the way, not the M2 or M1. and where he lengthened the fuselage by 2 feet in order to allow for positioning the center of gravity basically where the pilot would have been sitting. This area right here would have been the cockpit had it been an M2, for example. The cockpit is actually back here, Spirit. And this is a almost 300-gallon gasoline tank. That has a significant impact on where you put the CG on the airplane. Well, Lindbergh had already, one of his stipulations was, by the way, that he had to be behind, aft of all fuel tanks. Well, you got a 300-gallon fuel tank that has to go on the CG. That means you're going to be sitting back in the airplane. So his cockpit got a little bit scrunched. He didn't have very much headroom, didn't have a lot of elbow room, but he had enough. They had to make a cutout underneath the tank, actually, to get his feet up there. Location of the pilot's seat, that's what we were just talking about, is aft of all fuel tanks. And there it is. And you can see why he didn't want to be sitting in front of the fuel tank. In the case of a rollover, a nose-over on a takeoff or landing, or any other excursion from the runway and run into a tree, if he had been sitting in the front, he'd be a dead man. Another view from the front. Periscope was a small item, but it's in the report. And these are pictures from the Spirit at the Smithsonian, showing it's being in a deployed state. And the that's the viewing port right there, when this is spit out. And he actually used it quite frequently on the flight. He said at the end of the day, when he was somewhat skeptical of its utility whenever he had it installed, he let him put it in on the basis that when it was retracted, it would present no aerodynamic interference with the aircraft. And it didn't, and so he let it be installed. But he did use it quite a bit, and was glad that he had it. The engine, like the gas tanks, was going to influence the CG. And so with that much weight in the center of the airplane, you had to move the engine forward. And so they moved the engine forward to account for that. And this structure that you see right at the end, there's a circle. This circle is the engine mount. This section right here is the extension of the engine forward in order to achieve the weight balance. And you can see here, there's the oil tank pointed out for clarity, and then behind the oil tank is a 180-gallon tank, and then behind that is the larger tank. Now, in his report, he talks about the flight test at this point, and I'm not sure why it got kind of misplaced in the report, but he talks about the flight test, what the objectives were to establish takeoff distances and weight carrying, load carrying distances, or effects. And then he jumps into modification of construction, and that's where this page is. So, as he goes through his calculations, he's got a 36-foot wing on the M2, and so taking from that, how large a wing do I have to carry a 5,000-pound airplane? He comes up with 46 feet. You have to lengthen the wing. It would be a lengthening of the wing design by 10 feet. And to speed up production, they decided, Paul had already started doing some design work on the Grom airplane, the B-5, or B-1. And he had already done calculations that determined that he needed an outrigger-type landing gear, a Fokker-type landing gear. And he had already done the calculations for where the wing struts would be on that airplane. He took those calculations and he transferred them to this design work because he had already done that design work with stress loads, etc. So he was going to use the Fokker landing gear. And the strut position. But the Grom has a shorter wing than the 46 feet on the Spirit. It has about a 5-foot shorter wing. But so he kept the struts in that position to reduce his design workload. And what he did to compensate, because when you move those struts inboard and you have more outboard wing area, you're putting more load on that outer wing portion, and you can get twisting and lifting that would cause you some real problems. So to reduce that loading out there on the outer wing, he made the ailerons much shorter. And I'll show you a picture here so you can see how much shorter he made it. I'm going to go forward here. Here's the M2 wing, basically. And look at the size of the ailerons. They're big, they're huge, they're barn door size ailerons. When you go here, here's the Spirit of St. Louis wing coming out. Now what I did is I kind of juxtaposed one over the other. So there's a 36-foot M2, M1 wing. And there's the aileron size. And the bottom is the 46-foot Spirit wing, and look at the size of the aileron. They're very, very small. And it affected the flight characteristics, but Lindbergh wasn't concerned about that. He had one purpose for this airplane to accomplish, and that was to get across the ocean. And flight qualities and that sort of thing were not high on his list. So with those outboard small ailerons, you had a bit of cross-control issues. There were a number of issues with handling of the airplane with those small ailerons. But he was basically a straight line flight. The only time he was going to turn is when he landed, and he could manage that, and he did. The outrigger gear, which is a Fokker design basically, or almost exactly, was incorporated on the Spirit. Tail surfaces, the decision, there was some discussion between Lindbergh and Hall on when Hall was saying we need a larger empennage in order to account for the weight and the wing balance and the engine being forward and all that kind of thing. And they talked about that briefly. And Lindbergh was concerned about the time that it would take to do that design work and manufacturing work. There were actually empennage assemblies hanging on the wall for the M2 and the M1 that they were, during production, they'd just go up to the wall and pull one of them off, and then they could go and start assembly work. So he wouldn't have to do any design work. He had to do no manufacturing drawing work. They could use existing inventory that was hanging on the wall if they used the M2, M1 empennage. And the decision was made they would do that and accept a little bit of instability as a result. A little bit of control authority, I'll put it that way. With the longer fuselage, Well, with the longer fuselage, there was a difference in control authority between a big and small empennage. And so they went with the empennage, primarily to save time. And Lindbergh saying, I can manage it.
Fred, when they did the empennage, the horizontal stabilizer is adjustable. Was that so on the M2, or did they have to modify that?
The horizontal stabilizer adjustment for trim was common on everything in the 1920s, and this airplane is no different.
Okay.
And it had that. Yes, it did. Streamlining came into play. Hall was really intent on streamlining the airplane to get all the performance he could out of an efficient airframe. And so he fared all of this area here with the wing joints to the fuselage. The wheels were turned inside out because inside he's already got disturbed air with struts and the landing gear stuff. So having this hole on the inside would just be another piece of a lot of disturbed air, but he didn't want, because these wheels are almost outside the problem. And
can't hear you.
He gained some.
Use the mic.
Oh, he gained some efficiencies by having the wheels turned this way with the servicing happening inside an opening, and out here it was scope. I'll do that. Okay, so anyway, he had the wheels so-called turned inside out so that the air filling of the tube, servicing of the tire could be done a little more awkwardly, but it could be done. Fillet streamlining was used, I mentioned, at the bottom of the wing and fuselage. The tail skid also had a fairing on it. He went that far to put a streamlined fairing on the tail skid. Power plant, we already know, was a J5C engine, and tanks for oil and gasoline were Turner plate, which is still around. It's a lead zinc coated steel plate that they used for the tankage on the airplane. This is the location of all of the fuselage fuel tanks and oil tanks. This is the distribution system, a valve system. He could transfer fuel from any tank to any other tank. And he had 2 service lines going to the carburetor so that he had a redundancy there in case there was a blockage or some reduction in flow on one side or the other. General dimensions and specifications span 46 feet, 7-foot chord, useful load. With instruments, it was 2,150 pounds. And if you went back and looked at the Belanca, it's within 2 or 3% of this airplane with all of its load characteristics. And these are theoretical, he's got theoretical numbers here, which were then evaluated in flight tests down at Kearney Mason. And if you wanted to know any of those numbers, I'd give them to you, but there's a lot of numbers that we're going to go down to. So anyway, you have all of this data, runway lengths. So they started out with a minimal load of fuel, just enough to get around the bay and get back, and takeoff distance was only 229 feet. That's very, very short. But under a full load, at 4,200, they never did a full load test on this airplane. They did go up to 4,200 pounds. When they were at 4,200 pounds, they broke the tail skid, so they had to redesign, not redesign, they just upped the grade of material that was used in the tail skid. But they didn't do the 5,000 pound test run, because if they damaged the airplane, that would put him out of the running for his expected launch date out of New York. And so they already had the airplane, it was already built, they're doing flight tests, and he and Hall decided that they would not do the 5,000 pound test on the basis that if they had an accident with that, anything would put him out of the running, because it would take time and effort and design and repairs and all that kind of stuff. So the only time it ever flew off the ground with a full load at over 5,000 pounds was when it took off for Paris.
Here's Fort Kearny.
I can't hear you.
Where is Fort Kearny?
Fort Kearny, is that the rugby field or is that the airport?
The test? Are you where did he depart from?
No, where is Fort Kearny?
I can't hear.
Where is Fort Kearny, the airfield he used on Kearny Mesa?
Oh, Kearny Mesa. Kearny Mesa, there is no airport there. There was no airport. It was just a cleared area. At Kearny Mesa, he did all of the weight testing flights were done at Kearny Mesa. And it was a rough field, it had rocks and it had a disturbed surface. But he did one other flight test, going down the Strand, and that was a airspeed test. But he didn't do any testing over at North Island or anywhere else. And nice paragraph out of the book, The City of Wings, which was a book commissioned by the WPA for the San Diego school system to put together a history of aviation in San Diego. And it was published in 1938. And Donald Hall was asked to contribute to that book and write about the spirit of St. Louis. And this is kind of his closing paragraph of his put in the book. The stage was finally set. Mahoney and his little factory were ready. Donald Hall, the designer, was ready. The whole world, although it did not know it, was ready and waiting. There came then with startling swiftness the most tremendous event in aviation since the day the Wrights first lifted their plane off the ground. I believe that to be true myself. Nothing else like it has ever happened. He became the most famous man in the world up until not very long ago. Everybody knew him. Now, he inspired aviation development. He showed that it was possible to fly across, non-stop, fly across the Atlantic Ocean, the North Atlantic Ocean, and the commercial opportunities were just laying out there to be had. And he made it. And that's a different story. The movie is very good, by the way, because it's very accurate. It's got little misses here and there, but the movie, The Spirit of St. Louis, is really a good movie. If you want to see what it was like. I've read all of his books and others, his biographies and all that. He was a very unique individual. Focused, he was very technical, outstanding pilot, and did clearly significant pioneering work in laying out air routes and commercial air routes and all that sort of thing. And he was a kid. He was 25 years old, for Christ's sake. And that being 25 years old, that's not so much an issue. Not an issue. A remarkable thing. I was 25 years old when I was flying in the Navy. But I wasn't laying out uncharted territory, uncharted aircraft maneuvers, uncharted design performance. I wasn't doing any of those things. And shortly thereafter, well, I say shortly, you know, it actually took about 10 years from his flight until commercial flights started going across the Atlantic. 10 years. This airplane paved the way, the Boeing 314. And the first transatlantic passenger service, June 28, 1939. 10 years later to get that going. But, and Lindbergh was involved with that, by the way, and laying out routes and so forth. You know. And I'll give you a little quick, brief description of what happened to Ryan Airlines after that. Mahoney was a business guy. He was a finance business guy. And he capitalized on the notoriety of the flight and the interest in aviation. And his backers got together with another group of finance folks in St. Louis, and they bought Ryan Airlines. And in 1927. December 31st, 1927, he sold the company. He cashed in right away. They kept him on as the president, a director and a president. And during that time, and they moved the company out of San Diego to St. Louis. All production. In fact, the whole operation moved up there. And so those folks that didn't want to move to St. Louis, they stayed in San Diego and got other jobs. The production run of Brougham models, which was the Brougham 5 series, 220 airplanes they built there. Ryan Airlines had built less than 30 M1, M2s. And Mahoney Ryan produced over 200 Brougham. They were all over the world. So from that standpoint, it was very successful, but now we're getting into 1929, and lots of financial things are going on with big companies especially. And Mahoney Ryan was sold off to Detroit Aviation, another finance holding company. Detroit Aviation was gathering up smaller aircraft manufacturing companies that were available, that were for sale for whatever reason. Lockheed was one. There are several companies that were bought up and absorbed by Detroit. And Detroit went bankrupt in 1929, in June of 1929. And a lot of people lost a lot of money in 1929. And evidently Mahoney was one of those. He was living in LA. There's a census report, 1940 census. I've looked at the 1940 census. Many of you probably have too, because it's the only one that's fully out there that you can go and look at online without spending a lot of money on research. But in the 1940 census, Mahoney was living in Beverly Hills with his wife, and the occupation listed as flyer in the aviation industry. And shortly after that, he went into a sanitarium. It doesn't say what his malady was, but he was there for 8 years. So it wasn't because he was drinking every night. That couldn't have been it. So he had some serious physiological problems that have to be housed in a nursing home, saying for 8 years. And then he died in 1951 at age 50. Pretty short life. His productive life was up through about age 45. No, about age 40. So anyway, that was the end of Ryan Airlines and the end of the players. Claude came back to, he didn't, his deal with Siemens didn't work out, primarily because he could not put together a finance group to build the engines. Because his deal was, you're the distributor, but eventually we want you building engines in the United States, not importing them, not us having to ship them and export them over to you. And he could never got that together. And as a result, Siemens bought him out. And so he came back to San Diego. Nobody ever heard from him for quite a long time. And then he started a flight school, right where he was at the beginning. And then he started up a mechanic school, a flight school, and that company went through a couple of iterations, or one iteration, Ryan Aeronautical 1, Ryan Aeronautical 2, which was the last one. And he got contracts from the U.S. government to train pilots, and using government aircraft, but at the same time, he brought on a couple of designers, and they designed the STA, or ST. And so with the ST, he had an airplane that he offered up to the service, to the U.S. Air Force as a trainer, and they bought it, and he took off from there. And that became the STA, and then the radio engine powered derivative, and he sold a lot of planes, and that put him on the map. Then he got other contracts and went on to finally sell off to one of the bigger companies, and he retired. But he did a great job in his later career. So next, I've titled the next portion, and I'm going to talk about our spirit here. And I've titled it Spirit of St. Louis 3, which is what we call it. But it should be Spirit of St. Louis 4. About 40 days after the flight, after Lindbergh's flight to Paris, the Mainichi newspaper in Osaka, Japan, contracted with Ryan Airlines to build a duplicate Spirit of St. Louis. And they did. And a little footnote, as you all know, the history of this building and design of the Spirit of St. Louis, there were no blueprints per se for the Spirit of St. Louis. They were essentially shop drawings that Donald Hall made piece by piece and passed them off to Boas in the factory so they could build the airplane in 60 days. You didn't have time to sit down and ink out a set of blueprints for it. So years later in the 50s, I'll think of his name in a minute. One of the engineers ink out a set of plans from memory. And those are the plans that are used today to build all the replicas you've ever seen. But they were built from memory in 1950, and they're very close. There have been some investigations of the actual spirit, some measurements taken that are different, but they're close enough that you can build a flying reproduction of the spirit. This airplane was an exact copy of the spirit, and it's the only one that there are blueprints for. And those blueprints are in the Donald Hall estate. They hold them in their archives. Donald Hall made blueprints for this airplane. And this airplane there was a fascination with aviation going on parallel to that in the United States, going on in Japan. And they were making flights and record flights and competitions and all that sort of thing. And this airplane went in and did several competitive record-breaking flights in the Asian theater. And it was modified later in its career as a front cockpit airplane. They did much like you would see on a Vega. They put a cockpit right up in the wing area. And some of their reproductions have been done that way too, where they have a convertible cockpit in the front. But then the airplane either crashed and it was lost, or it was lost in the bombing of Tokyo and Osaka, one or the other. But it doesn't exist anymore. This airplane is our Spirit 3 as it was delivered to the museum. And it's actually in the configuration of the aircraft that was handed over to Lindbergh. As you'll notice in the picture, there are no streamlined hubcaps on this airplane in the picture. There were not on the Spirit when it was handed over to Lindbergh. Those were added later during local flights before he departed San Diego. But when they handed it to Lindbergh, it looked exactly like this. Beautiful airplane, I think. It's just gorgeous. It's a minimalist design. It looks like a piece of sculpture. It's gorgeous. This is our airplane today, same airplane.